Chapter 3 of Spacehounds of IPC by E. Doc Smith. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Spacehounds of IPC. Chapter 3 Castaways upon Ganymede. Upon awakening, the man's first care was to instruct the girl in the operation of the projectors, so that she could keep the heavily armored edge of their small section, which he had promptly christened the Forlorn Hope, between them and the grinding, clashing mass of wreckage, and thus, if it should become necessary, protect the relatively frail inner portions of their craft from damage. "Keep an eye on things for a while, Nadia," he instructed, as soon as she could handle the controls. "And don't use any more power than is absolutely necessary. We'll need it all, and besides, they can probably detect anything we can use. There's probably enough leakage from the ruptured accumulator cells to mask quite a little emission, but don't use much. I'm going to see what I can do about making this whole wedge navigable." "Why not just launch what's left of this lifeboat? It's space-worthy, isn't it?" "Yes, but it's too small. 2 or 3 of the big dirigible projectors of the lower band are on the rim of this piece of pie-shaped section we're riding, I think. If so, and if enough batteries of accumulators are left intact to give them anywhere nearly full power, we can get an acceleration that will make a lifeboat look sick. Those main dirigibles, you know, are able to swing the whole mass of the Arcturus, and what they'll do to this one chunk of it, we've got only a few thousand tons of mass in this piece, will be something pretty. Also, having the metal may save us months of time in mining it." He found the projectors, repaired or cut out the damaged accumulator cells, and reconnected them through the controls of the lifeboat. He moved into the engine room the air tanks, stores, and equipment from all the other fragments, which, by means of a spacesuit, he could reach without too much difficulty. From the battery rooms of those fragments, open shelves, after being sliced open by the shearing ray, he helped himself to banks of accumulator cells from the enormous driving batteries of the ill-fated Arcturus, bolting them down and connecting them solidly until almost every compartment of their craft was one mass of stored-up energy. Days fled like hours, so furiously busy were they in preparing their peculiar vessel for a cruise of indefinite duration. Stevens cut himself short on sleep and snatched his meals in passing, and Nadia, when not busy at her own tasks of observing, housekeeping, and doing what little piloting was required, was rapidly learning to wield most effectively the spanner and pliers of the mechanic and electrician. "I'm afraid our time is getting short, Steve," she announced, after making an observation. "It looks as though we're getting wherever it is we're going." "Well, I've got only 2 more jobs to do, but they're the hardest of the lot. It is Jupiter, or can you tell yet?" "Jupiter, or one of its satellites, I think, from the point where they reverse their power. Here's the observation you told me to take." "Looks like Jupiter," he agreed, after he had rapidly checked her figures. "We'll pass very close to one of those 2 satellites, probably Ganymede, which is fine for our scheme. All 4 of the major satellites have water and atmosphere, but Ganymede, being largest, is best for our purposes. We've got a couple of days yet, just about time to finish up. Let's get going. You know what to do."
"Steve, I'm afraid of it. It's too dangerous. Isn't there some other way?"
"None that I can see. The close watch they're keeping on every bit of this junk makes it our only chance for a getaway. I'm pretty sure I can do it, but if I should happen to get nipped, just use enough power to let them know you're here, and you won't be any worse off than if I hadn't tried to pull off this stunt." He donned a spacesuit, filled a looped belt with tools, picked up a portable power drill, and stepped into the tiny airlock. Nadia deftly guided their segment against one of the larger fragments and held it there with a gentle, steady pressure, while Stevens, a light cable paying out behind him, clambered carefully over the wreckage, brought his drill into play, and disappeared inside the huge wedge. In less than an hour he returned without mishap, and reported to the glowing girl. "Just like shooting fish down a well. Most of the accumulator cells were tight, and installing the relays wasn't a bad job at all. Believe me, girl, there'll be junk filling all the space between here and Saturn when we touch them off."
"Wonderful, Steve," Nadia exclaimed. "It won't be so bad seeing you go into the others, now that you have this one all rigged up."
Around and around the mass of wreckage they crept, and in each of the larger sections Stevens connected up the enormous fixed or dirigible projectors to whatever accumulator cells were available through sensitive relays, all of which he could close by means of one radio impulse. The long and dangerous task done, he stood at the lookout plate, studying the huge disk which had been the upper portion of the lower half of the Arcturus, and frowning in thought. Nadia reached over his shoulder and switched off the plate. "Nix on that second job, big fellow," she declared. "They aren't really necessary, and you're altogether too apt to be killed trying to get them. It's too ghastly. I won't stand for your trying it, so that ends it." "We ought to have them, really," he protested. "With those special tools, cutting torches, and all the stuff, we'd be sitting pretty. We'll lose weeks of time by not having them." "We'll just have to lose it then. You can't get 'em, any more than a baby can get the moon, so stop crying about it." She went over the familiar argument for the 20th time. "That stuff up there is all grinding together like cakes of ice in a flow. The particular section you want is in plain sight of whoever is on watch, and those tools and things are altogether too heavy to handle. You're a husky brute, I know, but even you couldn't begin to handle them, even if you had good going. I couldn't help you very much, even if you'd let me try, and the fact that you so positively refuse to let me come along shows how dangerous you know the attempt is bound to be. You'd probably never even get up there alive, to say nothing of getting back here. No, Steve, that's out like a light." "I sure wish they'd left us weightless for a while sometime, if only for an hour or two," he mourned. "But they didn't," she retorted practically. "So we're just out of luck to that extent. Our time is about up, too. It's time you worked us back to the tail end of this procession, or rather the head end, since we're traveling down now." Stevens took the controls and slowly worked along the outer edge of the mass, down toward its extremity. Nadia put one hand upon his shoulder, and he glanced around. "Thanks, Steve. We have a perfectly wonderful chance as it is, and we've gone so far with our scheme together that it would be a crying shame not to be able to go through with it. I'd hate like sin to have to surrender to them now, and that's all I could do if anything should become of you. Besides—" her voice died away into silence. "Sure, you're right," he hastily replied, dodging the implication of that unfinished sentence. "I couldn't figure out anything that looked particularly feasible anyway. That's why I didn't try it. We'll pass it up." Soon they arrived at their objective and maintained a position well in the van, but not sufficiently far ahead of the rest to call forth a restraining ray from their captors. Already strongly affected by the gravitational pull of the mass of the satellite, many of the smaller portions of the wreck, not directly held by the tractors, began to separate from the main mass. As each bit left its place, another beam leaped out, until it became apparent that no more were available, and Stevens strapped the girl and himself down before two lookout plates. "Now for it, Nadia!" he exclaimed, and simultaneously threw on the power of his own projectors and sent out the radio impulse which closed the relays he had so carefully set. They were thrown against the restraining straps savagely and held there by an enormous weight as the gigantic dirigible projectors shot their fragment of the wreck away from the comparatively slight force which had been acting upon it. But they braced themselves and strained their muscles in order to watch what was happening. As the relays in the various fragments closed, the massed power of the accumulators was shorted dead across the converters and projectors, instead of being fed into them gradually through the controls of the pilot, with a result comparable to that of the explosion of an